A county fair is supposed to be harmless. It is a place where lights blur into laughter, where noise feels like safety, and where nothing truly dangerous is expected to happen. But on a September night in 1992, that illusion fractured quietly. A 14-year-old girl walked away from the crowd, and something unseen followed her into silence that has never been broken. Her name was Misty Copsey, and what happened after she left the Washington Fairgrounds became a case that resists resolution. There was no clear suspect, no complete timeline, and no body. Only fading memories, conflicting statements, and a silence that deepens with time. This was more than a disappearance. It became a cold case shaped by uncertainty and early misjudgment. What happened in that short-distance home? Did she meet someone by chance or someone who had already been waiting? And why does the truth still feel unreachable? If you find yourself drawn into stories like this, where silence speaks louder than answers, don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe. Because sometimes the only way these stories survive is by being remembered, retold, and examined from every possible angle. Puyallup, Washington, was the kind of place where people believed they understood their surroundings. It was not a city, defined by chaos or unpredictability. It was structured, familiar, and contained. People recognized faces at grocery stores, waved at neighbors, and trusted the rhythms of daily life to remain consistent. Every year, the Puyallup Fair transformed, that quiet predictability into something brighter. It drew crowds from surrounding areas, filling the air with music, mechanical rides, and the layered scent of food stands. Teenagers gathered in groups, drifting between attractions, while parents relaxed under the assumption that the environment itself was safe. The fair created a temporary world where vigilance softened. It was loud enough to mask unease, crowded enough to make isolation seem unlikely. In that setting, danger does not announce itself. It blends in. It moves with the crowd, adopting the same casual rhythm, waiting for a moment that looks entirely ordinary from the outside. For most people, that night passed without consequence. They returned home with souvenirs, tired feet, and fading impressions of lights and noise. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing demanded attention. And yet, within that same environment, something subtle shifted for one person, unnoticed by everyone else. Misty Copsey was 14 years old, standing at the fragile intersection between childhood and independence. She was not known for reckless behavior. She was quiet, thoughtful, and often preferred the comfort of familiar routines. Books interested her more than crowds, and her world revolved closely around her home and her mother. She lived with her mother, Diana Copsey, in a relationship that was both protective and deeply connected. Diana paid attention. She noticed changes, asked questions, and tried to maintain boundaries that would keep her daughter safe. But at 14, curiosity begins to stretch those boundaries in ways that are not always visible. Misty was not trying to disappear. There were no strong indicators of rebellion, no plans to run away, no documented attempts to distance herself from her life. What she wanted was something far more common and far more dangerous in its simplicity. She wanted a little more freedom, just enough to feel like she was growing. There were small changes, though. Subtle shifts in mood, in attention, in the way she interacted with people around her. Some of these changes pointed toward a new relationship, a connection with someone slightly older. It was not necessarily alarming on the surface, but it introduced a variable that her mother did not fully trust. The older boy in Misty's life existed in a gray area. He was not formally identified as a threat, but he was not entirely reassuring either. Age differences at that stage of development can create imbalances in influence, in decision-making, and in control. Diana sensed something she could not fully define, but enough to remain cautious. Friends described Misty as navigating a complex emotional phase. She was not unstable, but she was changing. This is often where vulnerability emerges, not from chaos, but from transition. A desire to be understood, to be seen differently, can quietly open doors that were once firmly closed. At the same time, reports would later surface about unfamiliar men seen at the fair. These individuals were not clearly identified, and their presence was not unusual in a crowded public event. Yet, in hindsight, they become part of the pattern, fragments that might connect or might simply exist without meaning. Misty's home environment was stable in structure but limited in resources. A single-parent household often carries invisible pressures. There is love, but also constraint. There is protection, but also the risk of tension as independence grows. These dynamics do not create danger on their own, but they shape how decisions are made. Diana's protective nature may have felt restrictive at times, even if it came from care. For a teenager, that can translate into a quiet urge to step beyond those limits, to test the edges of autonomy. Misty was not escaping her life, but she may have been gently pushing against it. Nothing in her background suggested that she was preparing to vanish. There were no signs of planning, no packed belongings, no emotional withdrawal that would indicate a deliberate departure. Everything pointed toward continuity, toward a life that was expected to continue the next day without interruption, and yet beneath that ordinary surface there were quiet gaps where assumptions replaced certainty, and moments slipped by unnoticed, not from carelessness, but from a lack of reason to suspect anything at all. This is often where such stories begin, because most disappearances do not emerge from obvious danger but from familiar places where everything feels controlled, until the shift happens silently and cannot be undone. And no one in that town realized that within just a few hours of that ordinary evening, Misty Copsey would step into a space where she could no longer be reached, no longer be seen, and no longer be brought back. On September 17, 1992, the evening began with nothing that would later seem extraordinary. Misty Copsey asked her mother for permission to attend the Puyallup Fair, a request that fit naturally within the rhythm of teenage life. There was no argument, no hesitation strong enough to deny her. It was a simple decision, one that would quietly become irreversible before anyone realized its weight. She dressed in a way that reflected her personality, understated and unremarkable. A flannel shirt, a pair of jeans, and nothing that would make her stand out in a crowd. This detail matters more than it seems because it suggests she was not seeking attention. She was blending in, moving through the world without expecting that anyone might be watching her with a different intention. Her mother, Diana, drove her to the fairgrounds, trusting the familiarity of the environment. There was a plan in place, simple and practical. Misty would enjoy the evening and return home by bus. There were no last-minute changes, no sense of urgency, no visible anxiety. The structure of the night felt controlled, predictable, and entirely safe. At some point during the evening, Misty moved through the fair like countless others, surrounded by noise and light. The crowd created a kind of anonymity that feels protective, but can also conceal movement. People remember fragments of her presence, but none of those memories form a complete picture. She existed within the crowd, and then she moved beyond it. The last confirmed sighting places her around 10 p.m., leaving the fairgrounds. Witnesses described her as being alone, walking in a direction that aligned with her plan to return home. There was nothing in her behavior that suggested distress. She did not appear rushed, frightened, or disoriented. She simply left, as many others did that night. After that moment, the timeline begins to dissolve. There were no phone calls, no messages, no attempts to reach out. For a 14-year-old expected home that night, this absence is significant. It suggests a break in continuity, a point where intention and outcome no longer align. Something interrupted the expected sequence of events. Between 10 quarts and 10:30 p.m., Misty was believed to be near the bus stop outside the fair. This location becomes central because it represents transition. It is where she would move from one controlled environment into another. It is also where vulnerability increases, where movement slows, and where decisions can be influenced by external factors. No one reported hearing a disturbance. There were no screams, no visible struggle, no clear indication that anything had gone wrong. This absence of disruption is psychologically important. It implies either compliance, deception, or a method that did not require force. Whatever occurred, it did not attract attention, which suggests a controlled interaction rather than chaos. Moments like this are often misinterpreted because they appear ordinary. A person waiting, a vehicle passing, a brief exchange that seems insignificant. Yet within that normalcy, a critical shift can occur. Misty was in a place where multiple outcomes were possible, and one of those outcomes led her away from every expectation that had been set for her that night. When Misty did not return home, the first reaction was concern but not immediate panic. There is always a window where absence can be explained. Delays happen, buses are missed, plans change. Diana searched within that space of uncertainty, hoping for a reasonable explanation that would restore normalcy without escalating fear. The hours passed. That hope began to erode. By the following morning, the absence could no longer be framed as a delay. It had become a disruption. Diana contacted the police, initiating a process that would define the trajectory of the case. But even at that moment, the response was shaped by assumptions that would prove difficult to undo. The initial classification leaned toward the possibility of a runaway. This label carries weight because it shifts the direction of investigation. It implies choice rather than coercion, intention rather than interruption. In many cases, it delays urgency, redistributes resources, and subtly alters how evidence is interpreted in the earliest, most critical phase. Time is one of the most important factors in any disappearance, and here, time began to stretch in unproductive directions. While the possibility of voluntary absence was considered, other scenarios were not pursued with the same intensity. This imbalance can create gaps that are never fully recovered, especially when physical evidence is minimal or absent. As investigators began to gather information, small inconsistencies started to surface. Witnesses mentioned seeing Misty in conversation with individuals who were not clearly identified. These accounts were not initially prioritized, partly because they lacked specificity, and partly because they did not immediately contradict the runaway assumption. There were reports of a vaguely described vehicle near the bus stop, but nothing consistent enough to confirm relevance. In crowded settings, such details often blend into background noise, yet over time they gain weight. Attention also shifted to an older boy in Misty's life, raising questions about influence, though no evidence directly connected him, leaving his role uncertain and unresolved. As time passed, some witnesses became unreachable, while others subtly changed their accounts, shaped by fading memory or uncertainty. These shifts blurred the line between observation and belief. One claim stood out, suggesting Misty may have entered a vehicle voluntarily, reframing the moment as interaction rather than force, where trust or quiet coercion may have prevented immediate alarm or resistance. The claim lacked specificity, with no confirmed identity, no license plate, and no physical evidence to support it. It remained a possibility rather than a conclusion. Without corroboration, investigators could neither confirm nor dismiss it, leaving them suspended between interpretations, uncertain whether it pointed toward truth or simply reflected unreliable perception. There were no cameras, no digital records, and no physical traces to anchor the timeline. The scene offered nothing definitive. It was as if the shift from presence to absence occurred without resistance, leaving no imprint behind, forcing investigators to reconstruct events from fragments that never fully connected into a coherent narrative. In cases like this, the absence of evidence complicates rather than clarifies. Investigators rely on unstable memory and uncertain assumptions. By the time early efforts unfolded, it became clear this was not a simple disappearance, but something shaped by silence and perception, where each fragment uncovered only deepened the mystery instead of resolving it. In the early stages of the investigation, law enforcement focused on the most immediate geography. They searched the fairgrounds, the surrounding streets, and the route Misty was expected to take home. These areas were examined with the expectation that something physical would anchor the case. But nothing was found that could confirm direction, struggle, or interruption. There were no discarded belongings, no clothing, no items that suggested resistance or sudden movement. The absence of evidence created a misleading sense of neutrality, as if nothing had happened at all. Yet in criminal investigations, silence at a scene is not absence of action. It can indicate precision, control, or simply the unfortunate timing of an event unfolding without witnesses. Interviews began quickly. focusing on friends, family members, and individuals who had attended the fair. Each statement contributed fragments, but none formed a coherent narrative. Some details overlapped, while others diverged subtly. These inconsistencies were not necessarily intentional, but they introduced uncertainty into a case that already lacked physical grounding. The early assumption that Misty may have left voluntarily continued to influence the direction of questioning. This bias influenced which leads were prioritized and which were overlooked. It reflects a common investigative pattern in which an initial theory subtly filters incoming information, sometimes causing critical details to be missed during the most crucial early stages of the investigation. That early window, often referred to as the critical response phase, may have narrowed without anyone fully realizing it. Time moved forward, but clarity did not. Opportunities to preserve transient evidence, to capture fresh memory, or to identify movement patterns may have slipped past, not through negligence, but through misinterpretation of the situation's urgency. As the case moved beyond its initial phase, media coverage began to emerge, though not with the intensity seen in more immediately defined crimes. Local news outlets reported the disappearance, but without a clear narrative, public attention remained limited. The story existed, but it did not yet command the kind of focus that generates widespread pressure. Misty's family, particularly her mother, refused to accept the passive framing of the case. Diana Copsey became increasingly active, organizing searches, speaking publicly, and pushing for continued attention. Her persistence reflected a psychological truth often seen in such cases, where the family's certainty contrasts sharply with institutional ambiguity. Within the community, opinions began to divide. Some believed Misty had chosen to leave, influenced by her age and recent behavioral shifts. Others rejected that idea, pointing to her personality and the lack of preparation. This division did not just exist socially. It subtly influenced how information was interpreted and which possibilities were taken seriously. The pressure on Diana intensified as time passed. Advocating for her daughter required confronting not only uncertainty but also skepticism. In many cases, families become unofficial investigators, driven by emotional urgency but constrained by limited resources. Their efforts can uncover overlooked details, but they also highlight the gaps left by formal processes. Attention eventually turned toward individuals who had some connection to Misty's life. The older boy she had been seeing became a person of interest, not because of direct evidence, but because of contextual factors. Age differences at that stage can imply influence, and influence can raise questions about control, intent, and possible involvement. At the same time, the unidentified men reportedly seen at the fair remained in the background of the investigation. They represented a different category of risk, one that is more difficult to define. Opportunistic offenders do not require prior connection. They operate within moments, selecting targets based on vulnerability rather than familiarity. There were also individuals in the broader area with criminal histories, some involving violence. These profiles were examined, but without specific links to Misty. They remained peripheral. This is a common challenge in unsolved cases where potential suspects exist in theory, but cannot be tied to the event through concrete evidence. As investigators continued to review information, older reports of assaults against women in nearby areas began to surface. These incidents raised the possibility that Misty's disappearance was not isolated, but part of a larger pattern. However, patterns require confirmation, and without consistent identifiers, such connections remain speculative. Some witnesses became less cooperative over time, whether due to fading memory, personal reasons, or discomfort with continued involvement. Others could no longer be located. Each lost testimony reduced the ability to reconstruct the event with accuracy. Memory, unlike physical evidence, degrades, shifts, and adapts, often without awareness. The case file gradually revealed its own gaps, with incomplete follow-ups, unresolved notes, and leads that could not be verified. This fragmentation reflected not failure, but the limits of evolving interpretation. Years later, reports suggested Misty's belongings may have been found, yet without forensic confirmation, these claims remained uncertain, suspended between relevance and doubt, never fully becoming part of the case. A later witness statement suggested Misty may have been persuaded or quietly coerced into entering a vehicle, reflecting patterns where manipulation replaces force. However, without corroboration, its significance remained limited. Rather than resolving the case, such details expanded it, adding layers of interpretation and turning a single event into multiple unresolved possibilities existing side by side. Over time, the case shifted from a search into an abstraction shaped by absence and perception. Incomplete information and fading memory altered how evidence was understood. What once seemed straightforward became uncertain, existing in a space where clarity could not be secured and where each emerging answer only led further into deeper and more persistent doubt. Decades have passed, and the disappearance of Misty Copsey remains suspended in uncertainty. There is no body to confirm an ending, no perpetrator to assign responsibility, and no single narrative that can withstand scrutiny. What remains are theories, each shaped by fragments of evidence and the psychological need to impose structure on something that resists resolution. Theory A suggests a targeted abduction, where Misty was not chosen at random, but observed in advance. This possibility implies familiarity, even if indirect. Someone may have noticed her routines, her personality, or her vulnerability. The absence of visible struggle supports the idea of a controlled interaction, where trust or deception replaced force in the critical moment. The strength of this theory lies in its ability to explain the silence. A person who had already focused on Misty would understand how to approach her without raising alarm. They would recognize the environment, anticipate her movements, and choose a moment where intervention could occur without attracting attention from others nearby. However, the weakness remains significant. There is no identifiable individual who fits this role with sufficient evidence. Without a clear suspect, the theory becomes conceptual rather than actionable. It explains how something could have happened, but not who made it happen, leaving a gap that cannot be bridged through inference alone. Theory B shifts the focus toward an opportunistic predator. In this version, Misty's vulnerability was situational rather than predetermined. She was alone, in transition, and briefly disconnected from immediate protection. For certain offenders, this combination is enough. They do not require prior knowledge, only a moment where risk is minimized and access is possible. This theory aligns with the environment of the fair, where large crowds create both visibility and concealment. A person can observe without being noticed, approach without raising suspicion, and leave without being remembered clearly. The randomness of such an encounter makes it difficult to trace, which explains the absence of consistent witness accounts. Yet this explanation also has limitations. Opportunistic crimes often leave behind fragments, small inconsistencies, or partial observations that can be connected over time. In Misty's case, those fragments exist, but do not converge. They suggest possibility, but not confirmation, leaving the theory plausible but incomplete. When comparing these perspectives, the distinction becomes philosophical as much as investigative. A targeted act implies intention and focus, a narrowing of attention onto a specific individual. An opportunistic act suggests fluidity, where the victim is defined by circumstance rather than identity. Both paths lead to the same outcome, but through fundamentally different psychological processes. Which theory carries more weight depends on how one interprets the absence of evidence. Does silence indicate planning, or does it reflect the randomness of an encounter that left no trace? In cases like this, the answer often lies not in choosing one explanation, but in understanding why both remain equally difficult to dismiss. From a psychological standpoint, Misty's age becomes a critical factor. Adolescence is a period defined by transition where the desire for independence coexists with limited experience in assessing risk. Trust is extended more easily, especially when the interaction appears familiar or non-threatening. This does not indicate naivety, but developmental reality. If the perpetrator was someone who engaged her directly, their approach would likely have been subtle. There would be no immediate escalation, no visible coercion. Instead, the interaction would rely on tone, context, and timing. Compliance in such situations does not require force. It requires the absence of perceived danger at the moment of decision. In cases involving opportunistic offenders, the psychology shifts toward pattern recognition. These individuals often scan environments for vulnerability, identifying targets based on isolation, distraction, or accessibility. The act itself is less about the individual and more about the conditions that allow the act to occur without resistance. The lack of physical evidence in this case may reflect both psychological models. A controlled approach leaves little disturbance, while a rapid opportunistic act can occur before anyone registers a deviation from normal behavior. In both scenarios, the event is contained within a narrow window that closes quickly, leaving little behind. Another layer to consider is the limitation of investigative tools at the time. In 1992, surveillance was minimal and digital tracking did not exist. Much of the case relied on human memory, which is inherently unstable. Details shift, timelines blur, and certainty becomes difficult to maintain, especially as time continues to pass. From a philosophical perspective rooted in Eastern thought, the concept of cause and consequence emerges quietly within this case. A single decision, such as attending a fair or choosing to return home alone, can intersect with countless unseen variables. The outcome is not predetermined, but once it occurs, it cannot be reversed or reinterpreted. This perspective does not assign blame. Instead, it highlights the fragile nature of decision-making within complex systems. Misty's choice was ordinary, repeated by countless others without consequence. Yet in her case, that ordinary choice intersected with something unseen, creating an outcome that continues to resist explanation. Western philosophical thought frames the case through human nature, suggesting harm can occur without motive, remorse, or confession, leaving no trace in evidence or conscience. In this context, silence is not neutral but active, shaping perception and prolonging uncertainty as the mind searches for meaning, even though some cases resist structure and remain unresolved indefinitely beyond interpretation. More than 30 years have passed, and Misty Copsey has never been found. There is no definitive answer for her mother, no resolution that can bring clarity or closure. The absence remains, not just as a missing person, but as an unanswered question that continues to exist in the space between memory and reality. Cases like this do more than document crime. They reveal the limits of certainty, the fragility of the routine, and the way a single moment can fracture an entire narrative. They remind us that safety is often a perception, not a guarantee, and that control can disappear without warning or explanation. Some crimes leave no visible trace, no clear beginning or end. They exist only in the questions they generate and the silence they leave behind. And in that silence, the need for answers does not fade. It deepens, echoing across time without resolution. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.